Hi, this is Penn Shelton, and I'll be doing my older adult oral video presentation on Erickson's stage for adolescence, stage 5, identity versus identity confusion. I interviewed a man who will go with the pseudonym Dan. It's not his real name, and throughout the slides of the PowerPoint, you may also see him referred to as interviewee. That's a replacement for the general term often used in charting for client. And you'll also see here's the link for the video, which should work after I complete it and upload it. If not, I may need to upload the PowerPoint with a new link, but we'll see. A little bit about Dan, the man I interviewed. He's a 72-year-old white, straight, Jewish man from Brooklyn, New York, originally. He's twice divorced. He has 2 adult children from his second wife, a son and a daughter. He's currently in a relationship, but he's not looking to get married again after 2 failed marriages. His son is independent and lives on his own. They have a pretty decent relationship. His daughter is supported by him and sometimes lives with him on and off. They have a very contentious relationship. Dan was raised in Brooklyn by both of his parents in a Jewish neighborhood and went on to have a successful career as a popular radio DJ in a major northeastern city. He's currently retired. I used some vague information rather than facts so that he wouldn't be easily identified, as he's somewhat well known regionally. A little about this stage. So I interviewed Dan and we talked about many things across his whole lifespan, many periods of time that were important to him. And throughout the interview, as we asked different questions about significant periods of his life and significant formative events, he continued to go back to the time of adolescence as the time that he really felt was a time that was the most formative and most impactful on the rest of his development and the rest of his life. So I chose to focus on this adolescent stage in Erickson's model throughout my presentation. So stage 5, adolescence, is generally ages 12 to 18 with some variance by a year or two, if any. And the psychosocial crisis for this stage is identity versus identity confusion. From Rogers' text, we see adolescents are exploring who they are and developing their sense of identity. They try out roles for the future and integrate these into their sense of self. Adolescents who have difficulty integrating their roles into their identity will experience confusion about who they are. This can often lead to anxiety, depression, or just a sense of searching, looking for something to feel a part of or feel that they fit in life. So I highlighted some bullet points from the interview with Dan, which I'll go into a little more detail here. One of the earlier major events in this stage of adolescence was bar mitzvah. Bar mitzvah is the Jewish coming of age ceremony, which takes place at the age of 13 for boys and 12 for girls. And the bar mitzvah for Dan was a real integration, he felt, of joining the Jewish community, becoming part of a line of boys who become men throughout the history of the Jewish people. And this is an opportunity for him to join the community as an adult in the eyes of his religion. He also got into playing sports. One area of contention for Dan was that his brother was a couple years younger but was a much more talented athlete. Dan was much more of an intellectual and a great student. His brother was a phenomenal athletic ability young man, and he was able to really go far at a young age and outclass people older than him. Their father was someone who really valued sports. He was a gambler and really valued athleticism over intellect, even though he was a lawyer and he himself was not an athlete but more of an intellectual. He valued sports, and so this was a little bit of an identity struggle for Dan, that his father didn't really accept him. He did start playing sports. He had some issues with weight when he was younger, but once he started moving into 13, 14, 15 years old, he actually developed some athletic ability, was pretty decent at baseball, and really was more seeking for his father's approval than really trying to accomplish anything as an athlete. There was a big event for Dan where he heard a song on the radio when his father was driving, and his father was flipping through stations waiting for a baseball game to come back on the announcements. And Dan heard a song that he had never heard before, and it just awakened something passionate inside him. And this was his first experience where music spoke to him. And later, as noted, he went on to have a successful career in music entertainment industry. But this was his first pivotal event, which would later lead him in that direction, although it wouldn't really come to fruition for several years until he got his first taste of the entertainment industry. Other events were fighting with his parents fighting with each other, and those issues with his father, as mentioned before. One of the later events that was pivotal towards the end of this stage was having his first real relationship at the age of 18. He was dating a 17-year-old and went to prom with his girlfriend. And this for him was, up till this point, he had struggled with relationships, struggled with kind of feeling attractive to the opposite sex. He had always been very funny and very smart, but he was a year ahead of his peers in his classes because he had done so well in school. But this put him at a physically developmental step behind his peers, and always felt self-conscious about this. And so you could see not just weight, but also age and development was an ongoing issue for him throughout this stage. Some of the difficult challenges, to go into more detail, his parents had a very difficult relationship. His father was a very cold, stoic man. His mother was very hot and emotional and full of rage. This would later affect him greatly, and it would always haunt him years after even his adulthood. Again, issues with relationships and women, self-esteem, these were things that continued to follow Dan around in his identity crisis of the few years of his teens before he found his way to solidifying his beliefs in himself and his identity. He had some issues with women leading up to that relationship with the woman who he took to prom, and that was part of his ongoing identity crisis, was finding his place, finding a sense of feeling loved and attracted to. A big event that took place for him was starting at the age of 15. During the summers, Dan would go out and find jobs between school year, and he first got a job at an architecture firm in the mailroom and just got into the office culture, the corporate culture, and kind of was just a kid moving around and just getting to know people. But it was his first sense of autonomy and independence, his first ability to really network and join the adult culture. And again, most of his friends were playing baseball, and he was having his first full-time job. So this was a big effort for him to take strides forward in establishing himself as an adult and establishing a sense of confidence and his own sense of agency in the world. Again, his first relationship towards the age of 17, 18 was big for him, and this was the first time he really felt that he was able to be loved by someone other than family, and this was an opportunity for him to really connect with himself. Obviously, in adolescence, sex and romance is a huge fixation through puberty and through the awakening of those different urges and desires and needs through the development, physical and hormonal. This was the culmination of it for the first time for him, and so this was a big moment for him. Looking more at the psychosocial crisis, at this stage, people are developing from children into adulthood and facing many different changes, both cognitively, emotionally, and physiologically, that come through puberty. This is a time when people start to develop attachments and static self-image and can form lasting personality traits. These patterns will often last through the rest of their lives once they really take root. People start to have these beliefs about themselves and ideas about the world and what their place in the world is. If the individual struggles in this phase or falls into the identity confusion, they might start to struggle with having solid beliefs about their identity in the world and how they fit into the bigger picture in their mind. Diversity and differences, these are factors. So being that Dan came from a Jewish family, he was a second generation European or Ashkenazi Jew. Means his grandparents had immigrated to this country in the early 1900s. He felt that they had an old world mentality, a culture of poverty and uneducated, kind of just having to strive and work really hard just to get ahead in the world. And he felt a little bit beaten down by this old world mentality growing up in the city of New York and industry and surrounded by advancing culture and technology. And he was smart and educated, unlike his grandparents in terms of education and opportunity. So he felt a little held back by his family culture. Additionally, he also faced anti-Semitism in New York due to his being Jewish and due to being part of the Jewish community. He faced a lot of prejudice from other people. He was a young man trying to make his way in the urban world. Again, he was working at the age of 15. Coming from a lower middle class socioeconomic family and culture, he felt inferior in terms of status and material possessions. He had friends whose parents bought them cars, and he had one friend with a record player mounted in his car, and that guy came from a rich family. And so there was a lot of inferiority, and this was a very big challenge to his sense of identity. He did have good public school education. He was ahead of his peers for his age group. He was placed a grade ahead due to his good performance in school. He graduated early and got into college early. So that was actually a protective factor in terms of his feeling good about himself. The oppression for being Jewish and was a lot of times coming from Italian and Irish peers of his, and there was a lot of racism rampant in New York in the 50s and 60s. Actually, he felt more close to African American and even sometimes the Hispanic peers of his because he felt that they were also facing racism, whereas there was racism between Italian and Irish, but a lot of times they didn't have to face oppression as a minority group. And so he felt he was part of a minority group, and this added to the identity struggle, trying to fit in and find his place in the world. One protective factor and reinforced for him was joining Jewish community, being involved in a synagogue and a temple, and having a rabbi and other people who were members of the Jewish community who were engaged, and was able to find a place for himself in the community that reinforced his sense of cultural identity and allowed him to develop some pride and self-worth behind it. Looking through the systems lens, at the individual and family level, he was overweight, which had caused self-esteem issues and confidence issues. The family dynamics of his distant father and emotionally abusive mother created stress and difficulty at home. His brother being favored by his father as athletic and therefore seen as the better son really hurt his self-esteem. Dan sought to show himself off and prove himself through intellectual endeavors and achievements, but nothing he ever did seemed good enough, which was part of his ongoing identity struggle. At the community level, he sought connections through Jewish organizations, a Jewish community center, local temples, friendships with people in the Jewish community, as well as friendships in school with people who were non-Jewish, and really just starting to establish true friendships and support structures outside of the family home and outside of his Jewish community, which allowed him to feel part of something bigger and also to feel a sense of self.